Hey, history students. All right, I have your journal prompt up on the board, on the screen actually. I'm not going to be there for a little while, so you're not getting out of your journal, so make sure you write that down. You can pause the video and then move forward. Also, your sub's going to show you CNN 10 too. All right, so we just talked about imperialism and nativism and how, the United States was expanding and how worldwide it was expanding. In the 1800s, it was one of the biggest things, the biggest push in the world throughout Europe and throughout the United States. We gained the Louisiana Purchase. We were going to fight in the Spanish-American War, and we're going to gain Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and California. And we're going to continue on. We're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, and your prompt was, what do you know about Theodore Roosevelt? So we are going to talk about the Spanish-American War and kind of round out the late 1800s into the 1900s. We know that he eventually becomes the president after William McKinley is assassinated. So I'm going to show you this little clip really quick, see if we can get it to work.
When school isn't a place you have to be,
want to go to school where remote learning can be as remote.
In the late 19th century, the Spanish Empire was only a fraction of what it used to be. They held on to Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a couple footholds in Africa and a few Pacific islands like Guam. However, in Cuba, there was growing demand for independence. The 1870s saw the Cubans fight the Spanish in the 10 Years' War, but the Spanish emerged victorious. Then, in 1895, violence erupted again, and the Cuban War of Independence began. Meanwhile, the USA was the great power in the Western Hemisphere and wished to expand their influence. For decades, Americans wanted to take over Cuba. There were attempts to buy the island, and there had been a few attempts by filibusters to take the island militarily. Plus, the organizers of the revolution, like Jose Marti, were emigres living in the United States, so the US was pretty tied up to Cuba. Back in Cuba, the Spanish were rounding people into concentration camps where many would die of hunger and disease. The yellow press in America used this and a few fabricated claims to rouse the US population to demand war. The US government was also unhappy about the guerrilla warfare, as it was causing heavy losses to the large American investments on the island. In February 1898, a US battleship, which was sent to protect US interests on the island, sank in Havana Harbor. The sinking was probably an accident, however the press fabricated the story, so although war wasn't President McKinley's desired option, he was forced into action. With the support of the vast majority of Congress, the US Navy blockaded Cuban ports. In April 1898, war broke out, and it was clear that the US had the upper hand. US ships were dispatched to the Philippines and defeated the Spanish Navy in the Battle of Manila Bay. The Filipinos had, just 2 years earlier, rose up against the Spanish themselves. However, their revolution ended in failure, and their leaders were forced into exile in Hong Kong. The United States transported these leaders back into the Philippines to lead the revolutionaries against the Spanish. These forces besieged Manila and declared the Philippines a republic. In June 1898, because of its now strategic position, the United States formally annexed Hawaii after they helped overthrow their monarchy a few years earlier. And they strengthened their position in the region by seizing Guam from the Spanish. Back in Cuba, American troops were able to take Guantanamo Bay, a naval base they would lease off the Cubans a few years later, and they landed near Santiago, hoping to take the city. The Spanish were able to put up some resistance. However, the American forces, which included Buffalo Soldiers and the Rough Riders, were able to defeat them at the Battle of San Juan Hill and El Caney in early July. Former battle was where Teddy Roosevelt earned his fame. Santiago eventually fell, and the Americans continued to occupy the city for the rest of the war. They then turned their attention to Puerto Rico, and despite numerous battles, they could only capture the southern half of the island. But with the loss of their navy, the Spanish could not launch a counterattack, so signed for a truce on the 12th of August. In the Philippines, however, the Spanish and the American forces were unaware that the truce had been signed. Both sides resented the idea that Filipino revolutionaries would take the besieged capital, Manila. So they planned a mock battle, which allowed the US Army to take the city, while the Spanish peacefully withdrew. The peace deal gave Cuba its independence, however they were under America's sphere of influence. The Spanish Empire had, in effect, ceased to exist after they gave the United States Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. However, the revolutionary element in the Philippines remained, so the Americans had to fight a longer and more costly war with the Filipinos to assert their control.
So a lot of information crammed in that short period of time. Hold on, let me stop this. So the Spanish-American War dealt with many different countries. One in particular that we're going to talk about is the Philippines. The United States actually gained the Philippines, and we held control of them, just like Guam and Puerto Rico, and over in the Virgin Islands. But they produced nothing for us. So therefore, after 50 years, we gave them back and said, hey, take care of your own country. So the Spanish-American War was America's first major step towards imperialism. Now remember the definition of imperialism. It's to expand our borders and to overtake other countries. It's a war created, sustained, and shaped by journalists. And we're going to talk about yellow journalism. A lot of journalism is hard to do it without bias. And so they try to push their agenda towards whatever they feel and that the American government should do. And so obviously the American public votes in our congressmen and our executive branch. And so therefore the yellow journalists try to sway one way or the other. Now, I'm not saying that's how media is today, but back in that day, yellow journalism would exploit things and tell half-truths.
In 1895, a little country called Cuba, which is off the coast of Florida, was owned by Spain. Cuba, like the United States, wanted its independence and started fighting for it. Spain responded to this by sending 200,000 troops to Cuba to end the little country's fight for independence. The tricky part for the United States was that there were American citizens living in Cuba, and the U.S. was concerned for their safety. To offer some comfort and protection, the U.S. sent the battleship USS Maine to sit off the coast of Cuba. The 392 American sailors helped the American citizens living in Cuba to feel safe. But things got messy when on February 15, 1898, a mysterious explosion blew the front off the USS Maine and sunk the ship. The Spanish were blamed. United States President William McKinley and the United States Congress declared war. The U.S. Navy responded by sending a naval squadron of ships to destroy the Spanish fleet surrounding Cuba, but a land attack was harder. Just 33 years earlier, the Civil War had taken a total of 600,000 American lives. The Army was too small to fight another war, so U.S. volunteers were recruited. A collection of cowboys, college athletes, miners, police, and others joined up. These new recruits were called the Rough Riders, and one of their leaders was Theodore Roosevelt, a future president of the United States. The Rough Riders attacked the Spanish, and 113 days after the war had started, it ended. A Treaty of Paris was signed, and Spain surrendered Cuba and gave Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. Spain also sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. This ended Spain's claim on other countries outside of its own. The Spanish people turned their resources and energy to improving their own country. The United States found itself as a new world power with increased respect from other nations.
So that was a good summation of what the Rough Riders were. It was led by Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt. And actually, that's where the teddy bear comes from, is Teddy Roosevelt. So hold on. Oh, what's going on with my PowerPoint here? There we go. All right, Spanish-American Wars. I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. What do you think that means when Teddy Roosevelt said that, or Theodore Roosevelt said that? He feels like, in conjunction with war, it unites a nation as one and helps a nation that's divided. And at this time, he supported the battles and the fight against the Spanish. Let me go out of this. There we go. Teddy Roosevelt thought that America needed a new challenge and an adventure. He was always up for it. His famous saying was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He would be kind until he needed to otherwise do something to knock down whoever was contrary to what he believed in. He was a big proponent of making men feel like they were powerful and could fight and defend their country. the Congress did not like him, and neither did the executive branch. So they decided to put Teddy Roosevelt on the ticket as William McKinley's vice president. It came back to haunt them because he eventually became the president. All right, so back to Cuba. Cuba has a rebellion, and we're going to try to help out Cuba. They were putting their, and you can see this individual down here, he's in a concentration camp. Now there's a difference between internment camp, which we're going to talk about with the Japanese Americans during World War II, and concentration. Concentration is a camp where they die, and internment camp is a camp where they're held and taken care of. So we had internment camps. We didn't have Japanese Americans dying, but we did put them in an area with walls that they couldn't get out unless they volunteered in the 442nd unit in the army to go fight the Japanese. Otherwise, they had to stay there. All right, the Cuban rebellion. Cuba was a colony of Spain, so Spain had expanded its borders, and it was, just like imperialism, what we were expanding into Guam and Hawaii. We annexed Hawaii, and we took over Midway. Those are some critical points because we needed them for points to refuel and to rearm in the future. Spain sent 150,000 troops to put down the rebellion. General Weyler, he came back to bite him. He actually was held accountable for killing these individuals. It's pretty tragic, actually. You can see in the pictures. All right, Cuba, in the prison camps, over 200,000 Cubans died. 200. Over 2 years due to the disease and starvation, Cuban exiles living in U.S. led by Jose Marti urged U.S. to intervene. United government refused to help. And so that's where the yellow journalism stepped in. So yellow journalism is fabricated or an agenda that's pushed to lean towards what their view and what they want the American government to do or the American people to do. And so they said, hey, you know what? The U.S. and Maine just got bombed and blew up. All right, here is an actual firsthand, I call it primary text from a soldier, and this is what they saw. It said, sir, we will relate to you what we saw with our own eyes. 460 women and children thrown on the ground, heaped pell-mell as animals, some in dying conditions, others sick and others dead, without the slightest cleanliness nor the least help. Among many deaths we witnessed there was one scene impossible to forget. There is still alive the only living witness, a young girl of 18 years, whom we found seemingly lifeless on the ground. On her right-hand side was the body of a young mother, cold and rigid, but her young child still alive, clinging to her dead breast. On her left-hand side was also the corpse of a dead woman holding her son in a dead embrace. The circumstances are the following: complete acclimation of bodies, dead and alive, so that it is impossible to take one step without walking over them. The greatest want of cleanliness, want of light, air, and water. The food lacking in quality, quantity, what was necessary to sustain life. From all this, we deduct that the number of deaths among the reconcentrate, and it's Spanish, was amounted to 77%. 77% had died in these reconcentration camps. And this was from a soldier that came in contact and went in to help them out. So yellow journalism is exaggerated, horrific acts that Spanish soldiers performed against Cuba. And that's what they featured. So make sure you write that down. The yellow journalism, an exaggeration of horrific acts or trying to sway or push an agenda one way or the other. All right, the Delhomme letter. The U.S. newspapers published a letter. It was intercepted from Delhomme, a Spanish ambassador to Washington. He called President McKinley weak. You don't make fun of your president, especially when there's an ambassador. And so it angered Americans. So you can see how yellow journalism is starting to push this agenda. And then there's the explosion of the Maine. And most likely it was a mechanical error. They don't know for sure, but we came back with a vengeance and we took down all of the Spaniards' fleets that were around Cuba. Weeks after the letter on February 15th, 1898, so we're talking at the end, remember we're also talking in terms of the Industrial Revolution and the circuses, and so think of what's going on in America right now. This is a huge change from Civil War up till World War I, and that's what we're talking about, up to World War I. We'll finish World War I before we go to Christmas, and then we'll come back and talk about the Great Depression. The explosion sinking was likely caused by an accidental fire. We still don't know 100%, but we blamed the Spanish for the explosion, and it was published all over the newspapers. In the newspapers, they said, "Remember the Maine." Well, we had just fought a civil war and had over 600,000 of our own men die. Our weapon systems were not quite up and ready to go yet. We didn't have the military that we needed, so that's where the Rough Riders kicked in. And they had a bunch of people volunteer, and Teddy Roosevelt led that. All right, so moving to the Philippines. So we're talking, we're fighting in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. We just took over Guam. The Philippines, we pushed the Spanish out, and we fought there too. We purchased it from them eventually. And then, like I said before, we got rid of it because it didn't have any value, had no resources that we needed. And we were losing money taking care of them. Under Spanish rule, Teddy Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of Navy, felt that the Philippines would be a key naval base in the Pacific. Teddy Roosevelt secretly messaged the naval commanders in the Pacific to prepare for war with Spain. To avoid war, McKinley sent a list of demands to Spain. He said, "I want you to pay for this USS Maine. I want a truce in Cuba, and I want Cuban independence." Spain agreed all but to the Cuban independence. So, on April 11th, Congress recognized Cuba and declared war on Spain. And they were expecting us to attack Cuba. However, we went and attacked in Cuba, or the Philippines first. So on May 1st, 1898, U.S. force launched a surprise attack on the Spanish ships, destroyed Maine's entire Pacific fleet in 7 hours.
Who was USAA made for? It's made for him, a veteran who honorably served. And it's made for her.
The history of American imperialism dates back as far as the Founding Fathers do, when Thomas Jefferson stated that he was waiting for the fall of the Spanish Empire until our population can be sufficiently advanced to gain it from them piece by piece. When Mexico successfully gained its independence, it wasn't long before the U.S. found the American Southwest in its hands after a war with the new country. Nearly 50 years later, after the U.S. successfully defeated Spain in 1898, Jefferson's prophecy would once again come into play. One of the results of the Spanish-American War was that several Spanish colonies fell into American hands. 2 of these were Cuba and the Philippines, and while the U.S. made it clear that it wouldn't keep Cuba, the story of the Philippines was a bit different. Hi everyone, Thought Monkey here, and today I'll be talking about the Philippine-American War. The Philippines is a nation made up of many islands. During the age of exploration in the 16th century, the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan arrived on the islands and claimed them for Spain. Over the next 400 years, the Filipino people were subjugated to the rule of Spain, which had some ups and a lot of downs. Even before the U.S. went to war with Spain and took possession of the Philippines, Filipino revolutionaries had already been struggling for independence from the big, bad Spanish Empire. And while at first many of them believed that the Americans were coming to liberate them from Spanish rule, it was clear that when they didn't allow the general of the revolutionary forces, Emilio Aguinaldo, and his troops to march to Manila alongside American troops, that the U.S. had other ideas in mind. In October of 1898, a conference was held to determine the fate of the Philippines. The Americans were given 3 choices: to hand the islands back to Spain, to give the Philippines its independence, or to annex the territory. While many anti-imperialist Americans were against annexation and quoted President Lincoln when he said, "No man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent," the fact is that those in power held a different view of the Philippines. President William McKinley believed that it was God's will for Americans to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and believed that they were unfit for self-government. And finally, he believed that it would leave a power vacuum of which Germany or other rival countries may be quick to fill. On February 6, 1899, the treaty to annex went before the U.S. and passed by one vote. The Philippines now belongs
to stop right there on that and move forward. So basically, the Philippines become a part of the United States. Don't know why it just keeps going back to this. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes very famous with his Rough Riders. Now remember, the Rough Riders were kind of a ragtag group of individuals who signed up. You know, they were college students, they were old military, they were farmers, and they charged on San Juan, became very, very famous, became war celebrities, even though they experienced little battle action. But it was enough to win. A splendid little war. So the Spanish fleet tried to escape on July 3rd, but the U.S. Navy sank every Spanish ship, ending the war and setting off wild celebrations throughout the United States. The war lasted only 2 months. 2,500 people, or Americans, died, but only 400 in battle. Most died of food, starvation, or food poisoning and disease, which we know during the Civil War that a lot of them died not because of battle, but because of battle wounds. So the treaty in Paris, Spain recognized Cuba's independence and gave the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States for $20 million. We still have Puerto Rico and Guam as part of our territories. Philippines is their own country. These islands became unincorporated territories of the United States. Remember what annex means. Annex means to add on. So the annexation of the new territories barely passed with 2/3 vote in the Senate. So 2/3 vote is 66 or more in the Senate. So the Filipino rebels had fought alongside the American troops against Spain, and said after the war, United States annexed, because they thought that we were going to give them back their own country, and then we turned on them and said, no, we're actually going to keep your country. Let me go back so you can write that down. So make sure you write the yellow. So war between the United States and Philippines broke out and lasted for 3 years. 4,000 Americans were killed. Americans killed 16,000 Filipino rebels and 200,000 Filipino civilians. So war is not pretty. War is always ugly. And we actually kept the Philippines for almost 50 years. And then in 1946, after World War II, the Philippines received their independence.
We'll stop the free trade hose up and make the fences tight.
In June 1900, the Republicans gathered in Philadelphia for their national convention. President McKinley was easily renominated, largely because the nation prospered. Teddy Roosevelt was selected as his running mate.
Roosevelt was nominated not because he was governor of New York State, but because he was a war hero, and therefore could add a lot of pizzazz to the Republican ticket.
The election of 1900 was a rematch between McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate in 1896. Bryan hoped to win this election by making the Philippines a central issue. On November 6th, Bryan carried only 4 states, and not even his native Nebraska. McKinley won by a landslide. In the Philippines, U.S. troops had posed as prisoners of war to infiltrate rebel headquarters. 3 weeks after President McKinley's March inauguration, they captured rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo.
There has been enough blood, enough tears, enough desolation. By accepting the sovereignty of the United States, I believe I am serving thee, my beloved country. Emilio Aguinaldo.
While war continued in the southern Philippines, there were few skirmishes around Manila in the summer of 1901. President McKinley appointed William Howard Taft the first civilian governor of the Philippines. Big Bill Taft called the Filipinos his little brown brothers. McKinley described Taft's mission as one of benevolent assimilation.
What was established here very quickly were schools and the introduction of American methods of education, English language, except that the American administration in the Philippines passed a law which made illegal anything that was anti-American, whether it was written, spoken, or even a picture. The Philippine flag was banned, although Filipinos found other ways to continue the struggle.
To see the Pan American, I went.
10 days after President McKinley's death, the residents of Balangiga, a tiny village 400 miles southeast of Manila, attacked the local U.S. garrison. While U.S. soldiers ate breakfast, the church bells rang a signal. Filipinos brandishing machetes emerged from their hiding places. 48 Americans, 2/3 of the garrison, were butchered.
To the Filipinos, this was seen as a victorious battle on the side of the revolution, but to the Americans, it was seen as an atrocity of the gravest proportions.
On the orders of General Jacob Smith, U.S. troops retaliated against the entire island of Samar, where Balangiga is located.
I want no prisoners. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms against the United States.
I'd like to know the limit of age to respect, sir.
10 years. General Jacob Smith.
And his troops followed the order to the letter, burning villages, killing men, and actually even women and children, and converting Samar into really a howling wilderness.
Oh, I'm only a common soldier in the blasted Philippines. They say I've got brown brothers here, but I don't know what it means. I like the word fraternity, but still I draw the line. Oh, he may be a brother of Big Bill Taft, but he ain't no brother of mine.
In Batangas, a province south of Manila, U.S. officers herded all non-insurgents into fortified zones. Everyone outside these zones was considered an enemy and captured or killed. The similarities to Spanish methods in Cuba were unmistakable. Leading anti-imperialist Senator George Hoare insisted on public hearings to try those responsible for these atrocities. 3 Army officers, including General Jacob Smith, were court-martialed.
You have sacrificed nearly 10,000 American lives. You have slain uncounted thousands of the people you desired to benefit. You have established reconcentration camps. Your statesmanship has succeeded in converting a grateful people into enemies possessed of a hatred which centuries cannot eradicate. Senator George Hoare.
1902, after more than 3 years of fighting, Filipino insurgents surrendered to the United States.
By the end of the war, Americans simply had no stomach for any more colonies. Even Roosevelt himself was forced to conclude that the Americans were not an imperial people. He said that the Philippines had become America's.
So basically, he's saying that we didn't expand after that, which is he's right. We did gain, and we're going to talk about Hawaii. We did annex Hawaii as one of our states, and Alaska in the 1950s. All right, so Cuba's fate. So that was the Philippines. They're part of the United States until after World War II. We don't give them back their independence. But we also are talking about Cuba too, and Puerto Rico. Congress attached an amendment called the Teller Amendment to the resolution of Cuban independence, promising not to annex Cuba. And we don't. U.S. involvement didn't end after the war, however. We set up a military government in Cuba. And we're going to find out down the road during JFK's time, we're going to have the Cuban Missile crisis, the Bay of Pigs. We're going to have a lot of different issues still that come from Cuba. And still today, Cuba is kind of a thorn in our side. Feeling betrayed that the United States had simply replaced Spain, Cubans began to draft a constitution that did not allow American involvement. U.S. agreed to withdraw troops only if Cubans included the Platt Amendment in their constitution. So in the Platt, you need to know this, amendment required Cuba to allow U.S. Navy bases, and we still have Navy bases there today, on the island, and to intervene in government when necessary. Now, think about it. How would you feel if a country came in and said, we can intervene anytime we want if we don't like what you're doing? So you can understand where the Cubans are coming from. The United States had brief military government before pulling out, and then Puerto Rico remains a U.S. territory today. So we're talking about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, we still take care of. At one point in time, Puerto Rico was trying to become a state, and they had to vote on it, and they decided not to become a part of the United States in full effect. They're still the territory, and I did look it up because we were talking about it in one of my classes. You have to have a passport to go to Puerto Rico. No, you don't. So the annexation of Hawaii, the leader of Hawaii, Queen Lily, strongly opposed the United States. In 1893, a pineapple planter, Sanford Dole, and the United States Marines removed her from power. And then in 1898, we annexed Hawaii, not as a state, but as a territory. One of the reasons we wanted Hawaii, because it was easy access to refuel, to rearm, and then hit the other Pacific areas like Asia, Japan, China, that area, the Asian continent. All right, China represented a huge market considered critical to expansion of American trade. Still today, we have what's called an open door policy. We trade a lot with China. You can look at your stuff that you are wearing or what you're using, and it has made in China. They make things relatively cheaper than we can. Many Chinese resented foreign influence, and there started a very secret society, a Chinese secret society called the Boxer Rebellion. They would come in and they would massacre if you were a Christian Chinese or had any influence from outside that you believed in. You can see in this picture that they're executing. So the effect of the Boxer Rebellion. Secretary Hay worried that the other imperialist countries would use the Boxer Rebellion as an excuse to seize greater control of China. So he issued a second series of open door notes, re-emphasizing the importance of open trade in China and the United States' intentions to preserve it. All right, so kind of a summary of what's going to go on this week. We're going to wrap up this chapter, and then on Monday you're going to take a test. So on Thursday you will review. We have 2 more sections left, and then you'll take a test on chapters 9 and 10 combined. Feel free to email me or to send a message to your teams if you have any questions.